So this is class 3 of Buddhism in a nutshell, class 3 of 5. And this marks the beginning of the period in the class where we are going to focus our efforts around a text called The Foundation of All Good Qualities by Lama Tsongkhapa. The individual stanzas are going to be screen shared. If you would like to get a copy of the text, you can really just Google The Foundation of All Good Qualities by Lama Tsongkhapa, and you'll find it. So, but we'll get to that in a little bit. There's a little bit of background information before we get there. Okay, so this slide is showing you an artistic representation of Lama Atisha Dipamkara, usually just called Lama Atisha in common language. Atisha it originated the tradition that the literary tradition that is called the stages of the path to enlightenment, or the lamrim tradition. It is, as I say, a literary tradition, and its goal, there are a number of texts, individual texts that fall into this genre. The goal, however, of all of the texts is to look at the sutra material, the public words of the Buddha that are contained in the sutras, and condense them and systematize them in a way that makes it easy for practitioners and lay people who are busy, people who don't have years and years and access to extraordinary great masters to help explain the subtle points of this sutra and that sutra. So to condense and systematize that material so that it can be picked up and easily practiced by any of us. And the Foundation of All Good Qualities that I alluded to is part of that lamrim tradition, the stages of the path to enlightenment. So stages of the path to enlightenment gets at this idea of a systematic approach to the Buddha's teachings. The Buddha, as we know, kind of just wandered around and gave teachings to the persons or groups that were in front of him at that time. So the level of the teachings that he gave on any given day were suitable to the audience that he gave it to. And when you're speaking to an audience that has a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, perhaps meditative realizations, you can provide an explanation at a deep level. When you're speaking to a group of persons that, sorry, one second. Sorry. When you're speaking to a group of persons who have very little experience or knowledge, then you have to provide a different explanation, even of the same topic. So of course we know that, if you are a doctoral candidate or, what have you, and you're speaking to a first grade class about what you are an expert in, you'll explain that differently than if you're speaking to your colleagues. And that's what the Buddha had to do. So that makes the sutra material more difficult to work with for most people, because you find different levels of explanation of the same ideas, the same topics. It's hard to figure out what is controlling, what is the subtlest view, the most refined view of the Buddha. Uh, but that's what the lamrim tradition. One of the difficulties that the lamrim tradition is trying to iron out. They are extracting the essence of the sutra material and giving us uh, a really easily understandable method. And it's called Stages of the Path to Enlightenment because we progress through the topics of the lamrim, and by doing that, we transform the mind and ultimately create the causes and the conditions for our enlightenment. And Lama Atisha wrote Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment, which was the origin of the lamrim tradition. This attempt to systematize and extract the essence of the sutras. And then, as I say, after that, many other great masters came along and also wrote lamrim commentaries. There are 18 great lamrim commentaries that exist within the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism. Okay, so this is a slide of another artistic representation of Lama Tsongkhapa. So if we briefly go back to the previous slide, we have the dates, birth and death dates. So you can see, for one, you can see that this lamrim tradition originated, relatively recently compared to the Buddha having been born 2,600 years ago. This is referring to, 1,000 of the Common Era. So, significantly more recently than the life of the Buddha. And then you can see here again on the slide of Lama Tsongkhapa that Lama Tsongkhapa even lived hundreds of years more recently than Lama Atisha did. Lama Tsongkhapa is the founder of the Gelug tradition, one of the four major schools of Tibetan Buddhism, which is the school that our center, Thupten Norbu Ling, is particularly associated with. Also the school that His Holiness the Dalai Lama is typically associated with most closely. His Holiness has a rime or non-sectarian approach, but the line of the Dalai Lamas, their tutors, have always been from the Gelug tradition. So His Holiness is, the line of the Dalai Lamas is generally associated with that tradition most closely. Okay, so this slide describes the three stages of the path to, the three scopes of the stages of the path to enlightenment. So the lamrim, the stages of the path to enlightenment, is organized into three scopes. And these scopes differ in the motivation of the practitioner engaging in them. Two of them are held in common with the Theravada tradition. So, because again, the lamrim tradition is uniquely Tibetan, is a uniquely Tibetan literary genre. However, of course, the material is the sutra material. So the effort, the goal was something uniquely Tibetan, or ended up in Tibet, because it was some of these were Indian scholars, like Lama Atisha was an Indian scholar, but Lama Tsongkhapa is a Tibetan scholar. But all of this tradition is what ended up in Tibet. So we could say uniquely Tibetan Buddhist, if we want to say that, or uniquely of the Nalanda tradition. But so some of the lamrim scholars are actually Tibetan, and some of them are Indian by birth. But that whole tradition is held in Tibet. So because it references the sutra material, then there are practices and wisdom that's held in common with the Theravada tradition. And then because the Theravada tradition. But because Tibetan Buddhism is part of the Mahayana tradition, then there are also unique aspects to the stages of the path to enlightenment, so the first two scopes, the small scope, the middle scope, are practices, wisdom held in common with all Buddhist practitioners, meaning inclusive of the Theravada tradition. The great scope is unique to the Mahayana tradition. The aim of a small scope practitioner is to create the causes and the conditions for a good future rebirth. So that practitioner is going to focus on kind of the most overt kinds of suffering that exist, that sentient beings can experience, and develop a concern about those sufferings and be motivated out of that concern to avoid those sufferings. That's the goal of a practitioner of the small scope. A practitioner of the middle scope has a wider motivation. They don't see a upper realm rebirth as a good in and of itself. They recognize that upper realm rebirths are also characterized by suffering. And so they don't see it as a good in and of itself. They see a utility in upper realm rebirths, but that utility only exists insofar as that practitioner has conducive circumstances, conducive conditions to finish their practices, their goals, their spiritual attainment. The goal of a middle scope practitioner is individual liberation, which is the stated goal of the Theravada tradition, which is why the middle scope is also included in that. For a Theravada practitioner, I should say it's a little bit more nuanced than that, because the real essence of the middle scope is to develop renunciation, to develop a weariness with cyclic existence as a whole. Whereas on the small scope, the practitioner develops a weariness and a renunciation of the worst kinds of suffering, but not cyclic existence as a whole. For a Theravadan practitioner, that renunciation of cyclic existence as a whole leads them to create the causes and the conditions for individual nirvana, for lower nirvana, individual liberation. But for a Mahayana practitioner, for someone, for example, practicing in Tibetan Buddhism, that renunciation doesn't lead them to creating the causes and the conditions for individual liberation. That practitioner progresses to the great scope. On the great scope, which is unique to Mahayana Buddhism, because, as I said, the stated goal of practice is individual liberation for a Theravadan practitioner. So they finish the path in what we might call the middle scope. But for a Mahayana practitioner, the middle scope serves to give rise to renunciation of all of cyclic existence, but not to then lead them to only create the causes and the conditions for individual liberation. they progress to the great scope. On the great scope, they practice bodhicitta, developing the wish to achieve full enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, as well as trying to develop direct penetrative insight into the nature of reality. That is the doorway, when combined with bodhicitta motivation, that is the doorway into full enlightenment. For a Theravadan practitioner, that they still have to realize the direct, they have to directly realize the nature of reality, the same as a Mahayana practitioner. There are not two entryways into nirvana, but it isn't coupled with bodhicitta. It is just the direct, non-conceptual understanding of the nature of reality, which occurs on, for them, the middle scope. What we would call the middle scope, for them, just sort of the end of their practice. On the basis of renunciation, they develop a direct, non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality and achieve individual liberation. Great scope practitioner has to join that direct realization with a direct realization of bodhicitta, the wish based on, and we'll go into bodhicitta, in the fourth and fifth class, but based on great love and great compassion, wanting to free all sentient beings from suffering, the same suffering that practitioner became deeply acquainted with when they developed renunciation. They see that all sentient beings are subject to that suffering, and they develop great love and great compassion, and then they want to free all sentient beings and not just achieve individual liberation. And so then they practice the great scope, and they combine bodhicitta with wisdom realizing the nature of reality. And that leads to the other goal of full enlightenment. The Buddha taught two goals, individual liberation and full enlightenment. When you combine bodhicitta with wisdom realizing the nature of reality, that can lead to full enlightenment. When you have wisdom realizing the nature of reality without bodhicitta, that leads to individual liberation. Okay. Any thoughts or questions? I will pause.
Yeah, do other kinds of Buddhism, such as Zen, do they have this breakdown of small, middle, great?
They have bodhicitta, and so Buddhism, they're Mahayana in the sense that they practice, that they realize bodhicitta, but I don't. That way of thinking about it could be unique to the way I haven't really studied other traditions, so I can't speak authoritatively in any way about them, but it could be a unique way of a unique feature of this effort of condensing and systematizing the sutra path. To think about the sutras in that way could be unique to how it's done in the lamrim.
So the lamrim is only Tibetan, you said.
Yeah, I mean, all traditions, you could say that, the lamrim is a commentarial tradition. It's, and all traditions have commentaries. All traditions have scholars that came after the Buddha who wrote treatises and texts and things that are trying to make the teachings more clear and so on. But this particular way of doing it is unique to Tibetan Buddhism.
Thank you.
Okay, so next we'll talk, we're of course still talking about the lamrim. We'll talk about the four features of the stages of the path to enlightenment. So the first feature or quality is described here. It says, none of the teachings are contradictory. So we said earlier that the Buddha in the sutras gave, described the same topic one way to one person and described it one way to another person based on the capacities that that person was bringing to the interaction. The Buddha, if he had the opportunity to give more depth because that increased depth could be understood, he would do so. If that increased depth wouldn't be understood, then he explained things more generally. Um, and he certainly gave instructions that were meant to help certain kinds of, to allow them to make progress on the path. Um, Whereas if he were to explain things in a subtler way, a more difficult way, could have given rise to confusion, and they wouldn't have been able to make progress. So that can look contradictory, when you, in the same way that if you have transcripts from, Neil deGrasse Tyson from a second grade class versus, an international symposium of physicists, the same topic, it could be like, well, why didn't you talk about this? Why didn't you include this? Why did you, in this talk versus that talk? It could look really contradictory. But when we understand that, that, for example, the teachings of the middle scope and the small scope are leading a person to the great scope, then we understand where everything fits. We understand that some of the things were taught for the practitioners for whom individual liberation was suitable. Some of the teachings were given to practitioners for whom full enlightenment was suitable, and so the teachings are leading people to what's suitable for them, and they might look contradictory, but they have that purpose. And then the second feature is that we're, by understanding that everything that the Buddha taught leads a person to enlightenment, that's the goal, that's the purpose, then we recognize that there's nothing in what the Buddha taught that was given as just an interesting idea, an interesting fact, kind of like, oh, this is why this is this color, or, there's nothing, everything is personal advice. Everything that the Buddha taught is meant for us to put into practice in order to achieve our individual, our enlightenment. There isn't anything that was just kind of presented as an interesting description of something. Because some things can seem quite dry, some things can seem quite intellectual, but we need to understand that its purpose ultimately is for our own practice, to move our own mind in the direction of enlightenment, and that it isn't just dry intellectual knowledge, even if it can kind of seem that way. Okay, so sorry, these are a little bit out of order, these slides. So this is the next, the teachings are protected from the fault of abandoning the Dharma, is the next feature of so here again, when we understand that everything has its place, then we naturally abandon criticizing. any particular teaching, or thinking that, oh, I'm a Mahayana practitioner, and I aspire to full enlightenment, so that means I should only practice the great scope, I should only practice bodhicitta, and this idea of the teachings on karma, or the teachings on refuge, or that those are for Theravadan practitioners, those are low scope practices, and they're not suitable for me. Because for a Mahayana practitioner, the small scope and the middle scope are practices held in common with practitioners of the small scope and the middle scope. So we're meant to hold the motivation, the aspiration of full enlightenment, and yet engage in practices held in common, perhaps with practitioners who are holding a different motivation, because it isn't as though that technology, that wisdom is unimportant, even for a great scope practitioner. And so when we understand that everything has its place, and why it is that way, then we don't abandon any of the teachings of the Buddha. We practice them understanding how they fit. Okay. Any thoughts or questions? Yeah, I mean, mantra is considered to be powerful. I mean, in Tibetan Buddhism, there are mantra practices. It is something that focuses the mind, and helps to align the energies. The subtle energies of the body and mind are kind of gathered and made sort of cohesive through mantra practice, and so. There are many stories of healing from illness and so on, through mantra practice. So that's certainly, the mantra is certainly considered to be quite powerful in general. I can't speak to that particular practice, but so this feature, this card, this slide is referring to the last of the features of the lamrim, which is, it's probably would have been better to write it as, it allows a person to easily see the threefold division of the Buddhist teachings. So there's two kinds of threefold division. We've talked about one, which is that it's organized into practitioners who are motivated to good future rebirths, to those who are motivated to individual enlightenment, and those who are motivated to full enlightenment. And then you could also say the other threefold division are the realizations of the scopes. So that is referred to as the realization or the three principal aspects of the path, which is renunciation, and the correct view of emptiness, and then bodhicitta. So renunciation, correct view of emptiness or the nature of reality, and bodhicitta. Those are the three principal aspects of the path. Because even, as I said, even on the small scope is a form of renunciation. It's renouncing the causes and the conditions of the worst kinds of suffering. So that is a form of renunciation that is broadened and deepened on the middle scope, where that's extended to even upper realm rebirths. And then on the great scope, again, it's the correct view and bodhicitta that are practiced. So those are the three, even though they don't correspond, the first two scopes correspond to only one of those. the third scope corresponds to two of those. So there's not like a one-to-one correlation between the three paths, but that's why it's called the three principal aspects of the path as a whole. Okay. So now we will go into more detail on the first scope, the small scope, which again, the purpose of the small scope is to give rise to freedom from the lower realms. So if you are a practitioner of the small scope, that's principally what you are worried about, is the suffering of the lower realms. But even for a great scope practitioner, freedom from the lower realms is quite useful, because the lower realms, the lifetimes of the lower realms can last for a long time. It is impossible to practice the path if the mind has taken rebirth in the lower realms. So it's sort of a massive detour from the goal of enlightenment. So even though we don't think of it as a good in and of itself, it's quite useful if you can accomplish freedom from the lower realms. And that's what the combined wisdom, the combined inner technology of the small scope does accomplish if you truly master it, if you truly have deep meditative realizations of the small scope, then it will cut off suffering of the lower realms. Okay. So this is now when we will move into the verses of the foundation of all good qualities. Oops. Okay, so this is the first verse. So as I said, we're going to take a slight detour, in a way, so as I said, the purpose of the small scope is to create the causes and the conditions to be free of lower realm rebirths. This is the first verse of the foundation of all good qualities. In the lamrim, this topic is actually technically presented before the small scope. What this topic is introducing, because it says the foundation of all good qualities is the kind and venerable guru. Correct devotion to him is the root of the path. By clearly seeing this and applying great effort, please bless me to rely upon him with great respect. So this is introducing the topic of what's called properly relying on the spiritual guide. And technically, it's not part of the small scope. It is one of the first topics, along with there's also preliminary topics in the lamrim on how to meditate and that sort of thing. But it's first, or essentially first, because it is critically important to all of the scopes. It kind of supersedes all of the scopes in a way. The understanding is that how well a person is able to practice proper reliance has a profound effect on how well they're able to master any of the scopes, any of the individual topics within any of the scopes. And that's why it's sort of, in a way, over and above all of the scopes, and not directly related to the goal of just the small scope. It's related to all of the goals. If we want that goal, if we want the middle scope goal, if we want the great scope goal, they are all informed by proper reliance on the spiritual teacher. Um, so, but in this particular presentation, it's kind of in this order, whereas technically maybe it's better to say that it comes before the small scope. And so, of course, the word him is used here in relation to the spiritual guide, the spiritual teacher. And that's only because this is a historical text written by Lama Tsongkhapa, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And at that time, there were virtually no female teachers in Tibet. In the 1300s, 1400s, it was virtually unheard of for great teachers to be female because of just the way that culture, that society was at the time. But that has changed. There are many extraordinary, highly accomplished, fully enlightened, teachers that are female. So a person's spiritual guide, of course, could be either. And it's just that this is a particular historical text that we're using. And they don't change. They don't change historical texts in Tibetan Buddhism to make them, to update them with the times. It's just not done. Okay. So okay. So we're going to stay on this slide to give further discussion on this concept of proper reliance. Before I do that, any thoughts or questions? Okay. So this is referring to a person's relationship with their guru, their teacher. And of course, for us, we may not have someone that we think of in that way, that we say, oh, I don't have a root teacher, I don't have a guru. That, a person might be studying books, they might be studying, through just kind of getting teachings when and where it's possible, and they don't really have that personal relationship. So the idea of a root guru, one's root guru, is a person, generally speaking, a person who is alive or was contemporaneous, more or less, with that person, and is responsible for helping that person more than any other teacher, more than any other. So a person can have many teachers, a person can have many individuals. They might study with one person because they're renowned in a particular topic. They might study with a different person who understands a different thing very well. But generally, they'll have one, essentially one root guru that they think of as really being the person that they attribute their spiritual progress principally toward. And then they'll have other teachers, that don't really fill the root guru role. So here, this is referring to, really, to all a person's relationship to all teachers, but in particular, you could say the root guru. And we can certainly relate to, for example, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama. If we've not met anyone in our actual kind of life, we can think of His Holiness as our root guru, or someone like Lama Zopa Rinpoche, any of the great masters who are sort of contemporaneous. Or if we're not quite there, even to that level yet, then of course we can refer to or think of Shakyamuni Buddha, as being the root, the principal guru for oneself. But in a way, it's usually referring to someone that you've taken, to a person that you've taken teachings directly from. That can be through books or videos, if not in person. But if if none of that's applicable, then of course, we can think of Shakyamuni as the root guru. So, but what this is getting at, what this is fundamentally getting at, is that it's perfectly fine and useful and necessary to to learn from historical sources, from books, from videos, and so on. But that there will come a point where progress, continued progress, will depend upon a more personal relationship. Someone that you can ask questions of, someone that you can clarify your understanding of the material with. Because if we only can ever rely on what we think we understand, what we seem to understand, and then also talking with other students who are pretty much like us, then we that has a place, that has a role, but it's a limiting. It will become a limitation at a certain point, and at that point, we overcome that limitation by really trying to cultivate a personal relationship with the teacher. Uh, okay. So then, of course, that relationship, there's a whole, all of these stanzas. The foundation of all good qualities is what's called a lamrim prayer. So it presents individual stanzas, but it doesn't really explain them. It's also called a glance meditation. So the foundation of all good qualities as a text is going to give us a stanza on each of the major topics of the lamrim, but it's not going to explain them in that text itself. The purpose of a glance meditation is really to give a person an overview of the whole path. It's often the foundation of all good qualities is something people recite. They memorize, they recite, because it takes you through the entire path very quickly. So it helps you to kind of see the connections and move through it very quickly. But of course, completely necessary to study more detailed treatises on the lamrim where those explanations are given. And there are whole chapters in these treatises of each of these stanzas. There are a few places, if a person wanted to start looking into that as an idea, one place that I like is not a historical treatise on the lamrim, but more of a contemporary treatise. It's called Practicing the Path by Yangtze Rinpoche. It was written, Yangtze Rinpoche is still a living master. So this book was written not that long ago. He wrote it for the Western mind, with that goal. And it is a commentary on the great treatise on the stages of the path written by Lama Tsongkhapa. So everyone, who studies Buddhism eventually studies the Great Treatise. But as an entryway, one idea could be practicing the path by Yangtze Rinpoche, kind of to give a commentary before studying the Great Treatise. The other FPMT has a great affinity for Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, which was written by Pabonka Rinpoche. That, for me, of course, it is Pabonka Rinpoche was a highly realized great master. Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand is a faultless, perfect commentary. It was a series of teachings given to Tibetans. And so there's a cultural understanding that was present in those teachings. And so it can be a little heavy on kind of the gloom and doom of the lower realms, for some people. Of course, we can't shy away from any of the topics in the lamrim, but that particular commentary kind of hammers things home. Again, I think because there was a shared cultural understanding, and there was a sort of a liberty or a license to go into certain topics in more detail and to really hammer them in a way that other treatises maybe don't as much. But it is a perfectly valid, fully, totally faultless explanation as well. When we take someone as a root guru, we develop that very special relationship, and that is the person for us that we feel like is leading me to my enlightenment, because this is the person that can clarify my doubts. This is the person that can help me understand, because through dialogue, through questions, and so on. And also, we tend to give that person license to maybe point out things that they are seeing in us that they think we need to work on, and we don't give that license. If a student said, "Hey, you're kind of showing signs of jealousy," or we'd be like, "Hey, mind your own business," to if it was a friend of ours. But our teacher, we kind of give that power to. We give them the power to show us our own mind by, with an understanding that they're doing it out of love, out of compassion. And so they might give us some constructive criticism that's meant to show us what we need to work on. And that relationship is considered critically important. Being respectful, and as I say, there's a whole chapter on that, as there are for all of these. So this class can only give a very broad overview. Okay. So the second verse, we'll now address the second verse. Okay. So the second verse is, understanding that the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once, is greatly meaningful, and is difficult to find again. Please bless me to generate the mind that unceasingly day and night takes its essence. So this topic is called Perfect Human Rebirth, is the title of this chapter of the Lamrim. Perfect Human Rebirth. Sometimes Precious Human Rebirth, or because the word precious is used in this stanza. So Precious Human Rebirth or Perfect Human Rebirth is the topic, the chapter. So What's a little, so of course we can just on a plain reading of the stanza, we can see the first line says that the precious freedom of this rebirth is found only once. But then in the second line, it says, is difficult to find again. So, of course, that can't be, those two ideas can't be literally true. If it can be found only once, then it can't only be difficult to find again, because it only happens once. Uh, so, what is actually being referenced by the first line is kind of the karmic coming together uh, of the all of the causes and the conditions that have to assemble simultaneously to give rise to a precious or perfect human rebirth. For that to happen, um, kind of from a lower realm rebirth or even an upper realm rebirth, for it to kind of spontaneously come together is something that is I mean, almost never could possibly happen. It's so unlikely that from that kind of, that when a mind is experiencing, let's say, a lower realm rebirth, a rebirth in the body of an animal, in the body of a hungry ghost, in the body of a hell being, and then that form dies and that mind separates, for every single cause and condition, karmically speaking, to ripen simultaneously that gives rise to a perfect human rebirth. That's basically, it happens, it does happen, but it's so unlikely that we can almost say it's only going to happen once, more or less. But if that is what happened for us, let's say, we don't know. Of course, we don't know what our immediately preceding lifetime was like. It could be that we were a practitioner in our immediately preceding lifetime, and we assembled those karmic causes and conditions due to our practice in that life. That is kind of what's being referred to in the second line, difficult to find again. So when you have a perfect human rebirth, you're able, through practice, to assemble the causes and the conditions of another perfect human rebirth or precious human rebirth. It's still not a walk in the park. It's not super, it doesn't just sort of happen without any effort. But with that perfect human rebirth, you have the ability to, with effort, with diligence and so on, to assemble those causes and those conditions. Whereas for them to be assembled more or less spontaneously, the difference between those two things is enormous. So, although it is not easy to assemble those causes and those conditions with the life that we possess, we do have that ability, which takes us to the the supplication here. Please bless me to generate the mind that unceasingly day and night takes its essence. So this means understanding that because I have a perfect human rebirth, I can make another one. I can create the causes and the conditions for another one. And not only another one, but really, really strong karmic causes and conditions that will give rise to a succession of perfect human rebirths going out into the future. And by relying on that, I can achieve full enlightenment. So the essence of a perfect human rebirth is the ability to create a succession of perfect human rebirths. That's kind of a way of understanding the verse on its face, in a way. Um, So, what is then a perfect human rebirth is what we'll now discuss. Um, so, a perfect human rebirth is not the same as just a human rebirth. It's a subset, a subdivision of a perfect human rebirth. So that implies that it's possible to be born human and yet not have a perfect human rebirth. So there are 18 qualities of a human rebirth that, when they are present, transform a human rebirth into a perfect human rebirth. And those are divided further, these 18 are divided further into 8 freedoms and 10 endowments. So the total of 18 conditions, freedoms and endowments. The freedoms are negative things, obstacles that in a perfect human rebirth are not or do not characterize our experience. So they're harmful, negative obstacles that could be characterizing our experience, but because we have a perfect human rebirth, are not characterizing our experience, are not present with us, not things that we are having to deal with. The endowments are positive, supportive, beneficial conditions that, because we do have a perfect human rebirth, are present in our experience. They do, in fact, characterize our life. So we're free from 8 negative things and we possess 10 positive things. And when we combine those 18 in total, that is how you define what a perfect human rebirth is. So it's certainly possible to, a in one way, it'll become more clear, I think, as we go through it, what what is meant or not meant by perfect human rebirth. It doesn't mean a life that's totally free of any kind of obstacles, like, a life where nothing is difficult or nothing is unpleasant, or even where things aren't particularly, things could be quite unpleasant, and still a perfect human rebirth would exist. But it is also true that things can get to the point where you no longer possess a perfect human rebirth, that you did at one time, and now you do not. So that's certainly possible. It's not immutable. It doesn't mean at the moment of your birth that 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 you can't lose it. And maybe as we go through, that will make that clear. But but yeah, I mean, just the presence of a difficult circumstance doesn't necessarily mean that you don't. But if that doesn't become clear, let me know. So we're going to talk about the. So we'll start with the freedoms, as I said. The freedoms is what we'll begin with. And so the first 4 of these are other kinds of rebirths. These are non-human rebirths. And because we are human, necessarily, at the moment, we're not experiencing a rebirth in one of these states. So these are, as I alluded to before, the hell realm, the spirit realm, the animal realm, and the celestial realm. And these are obstacles for different reasons. The 3, hell realm, spirit realm, and animal realm, are lower realms. And here, the suffering that is experienced by beings in these realms overwhelms any capacity that they might have to do anything virtuous, to learn anything to study, to meditate, because of the suffering that's present, and also to some degree the nature of how the mind is expressed. Animals, for example, they could be relatively cushy. They could be cats and dogs, and but they're not going to study a treatise. They're not going to meditate. They're not going to develop loving kindness that embraces all living beings equally. They may have some seeds in their mind of compassion and so on, for like the way that a mother would treat their child, but they can't develop universal love and compassion because that requires an intellect that they don't possess. So in the lower realms, there are sort of painful suffering obstacles. The upper realms, which are the god and demigod realms, those are not my favorite translations, but that's what they decided to call them in English. These are realms where there's less suffering than in the human realm. However, that there is an intoxication of that sort of sensory pleasure that occurs in these realms. And that's the obstacle. That's the reason that these beings don't engage in spirituality, don't meditate, because they don't really see the point. They don't see suffering in an overt form. And so they're not motivated to overcome suffering. So we are kind of like in the Goldilocks zone. We have suffering, we see suffering, we're motivated to overcome it, but we're not overwhelmed by the suffering for the most part. Certainly at times we might be, but in general, we can handle the amount of suffering that we experience. There's different. The demigods are a little bit different than the gods in the sense that the demigods can see the god realm, and the god realm is sort of above them. And then there's jealousy that arises in their mind, and conflict that arises due to that. And then the gods are at the sort of the top. So there's sort of different subtle differences between the two, but you don't, from the Buddhist perspective, you don't want to be born in either of them because you won't practice. It's a waste of time. Okay, so
And I,
so okay. So these are the remaining freedoms, difficult things that we are free from. So we could have been born. So the first were all non-human realms. These could apply to humans. So it's possible that, we could have been born 2,700 years ago on this earth. And had we done that, we would have been born at a time when the Buddha has not taught. And that is an environmental condition that prevents a person from having a perfect human rebirth, because the wisdom of enlightenment doesn't exist, in that place and time. It is also possible, the second is that the Dharma does not exist. So this is potentially an example that, like you were getting at, where on our planet, even today, there could be countries where many religions or all religions are actively banned due to, under the threat, the penalty of death. And there's an iron-fisted totalitarian regime in charge. So in the world, the Buddha has come and taught, and in many places, those teachings exist. But in that specific place, the teachings don't exist because of local causes and conditions. And that could also happen due to, in a country, that a country could change due to a cataclysm due to war, due to famine, due to strife, civil unrest, terrorism, um, the teachings could cease in a particular place. And, with the internet and things that we have, maybe there are ways of overcoming that, but you could imagine worlds that don't have the internet where, that kind of local condition is much more powerful. And even, of course, there are countries where they don't have the internet, where, so um, you certainly you can imagine that in local places the teachings could be wiped out. And then the next is not having defective sense powers. So in a way, there's different ways of understanding this. In one way, we can say that this is a cultural view that existed 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, where um, being blind, being deaf, and so on was incredibly difficult to overcome. Uh, and now it's much less difficult to overcome. So we can say that there's a cultural component to that teaching. Um, it could also have to be acknowledged that there are benefits, unique benefits, to being able to see holy objects, to being able to see the form of a Buddha, even in a painting or a tanka, or unique benefits of being able to hear mantra. Um, and unavoidably, we have to say that being deprived of those unique benefits, isn't good, is problematic. So does it prevent a person from practicing in general? No, of course not. But perhaps there are some disadvantages that even with technology, or at least the technology that we have, could maybe not be fully ameliorated. So you can kind of take that as you would. Um, so, and then wrong views is um, if a person could have all of these other conditions, um, internal and external conditions, but they might be convinced that that the Buddha, made it all up, and um, and therefore they have absolutely no interest, or they might be totally intoxicated with power or status, and that's all that they care about, and they're willing to lie and steal and cheat just to get more power, just to get more influence, just to become wealthier. Those are wrong views. Those are ways of thinking that cut off the possibility of enlightenment, that cut off, because if you think the Buddha just fabricated the whole thing, then you're not going to practice. If you think that the purpose of your life is only to conquer and to be a trillionaire, and then you're not going to practice. So if you really hold on to those, so these are philosophical views, these are ideas that we have in the mind that make practice impossible, even for someone who lives in the perfect time, the perfect place. If their mind is obscured in that way, then they will be limited. Any thoughts or questions about the freedoms? Sense. So, I mean, in terms of the mental sense power, I still think they'd be talking more so about, um, like mental illness or some sort of biologically acquired condition that makes it impossible to reason or think clearly. And of course, I take your point that misinformation that makes it quite difficult to reason and to think clearly. But probably it does, fall under wrong views. Um, okay. So we will end today on the endowments. These are positive things that we possess that make it um, easier for us to achieve enlightenment. So there are what are called circumstantial endowments. And a number of these are kind of, in a way, just the opposite of the harmful things. They're just the flip side of the harmful things. So circumstantial means sort of relating to the environment. Uh, so again, so these are: a Buddha has come, a Buddha has taught, the teachings still exist, there are followers of the teachings, and there are favorable conditions for practice. So we do live in a world where Shakyamuni Buddha, showed the complete path to enlightenment, and even 2,600 years later, all of that wisdom, all of that knowledge is preserved in our world. And it's a living tradition. It doesn't only exist in books, in libraries, kind of as like a dead language or something. People, might be able to decipher a dead language or something, but it's not a living tradition. But Buddhism is a living tradition. Even today, there are people getting the realizations, people achieving enlightenment. And there are favorable conditions, meaning that there are monasteries, there are nunneries, there are centers of learning, there are places where we can do retreats, where we can access great masters, great teachers. So there are favorable conditions for practice. And then there are personal endowments, which are not circumstantial. They refer to the individual. So here, uh, of course, being born human is a precondition, um, which is the opposite of, again, those other realms that we looked at as the negative. Being born in a central land is referring to a place, a local place, where the teachings are permitted, accessible, and so on, where there are Buddhist practitioners, people can access the teachings. Having intact sense faculties is, again, just the opposite. And then here, one of the unique endowments is not having committed the 5 heinous actions, also called the 5 actions of immediate retribution. The 5 heinous actions are to take the life of one's mother, biological mother, to take the life of one's biological father, to create a schism in the Sangha. And a schism in the Sangha means to go into a functioning spiritual community, which is what the word Sangha is referring to, and then to spread division, to spread harmful. It doesn't have to be untrue, but you're kind of saying, oh well, this person doesn't like you, and that person doesn't like you, and then you cause that previously functioning harmonious community to be rendered inoperative because they don't trust each other, they don't like each other. You've kind of set people against each other, and that's a schism in the Sangha. It's an incredibly powerful negative action. These are all extremely powerful negative actions: to take the life of one's biological mother, one's biological father, to create a schism in the Sangha, to take the life of an arhat. An arhat is a person who is in the Theravadan tradition. They've directly, or I mean, it could be someone who is practicing Mahayana but hasn't realized bodhicitta yet. But um, it, the more technical way is to say that it is a person who has a direct, non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality. So that kind of practitioner, to take the life of that kind of practitioner, someone who is well on their way to achieving either full enlightenment or individual liberation because they've achieved this direct non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality. And then the fifth is to maliciously draw the blood of a Buddha, is the next. So to maliciously wound or draw the blood of a Buddha, that comes from a story in the sutras where Devadatta, the cousin of Shakyamuni Buddha, did not like Shakyamuni Buddha, was kind of a thorn in the side. I guess that's kind of a funny way of putting it, given the drawing the blood of a Buddha. But so there was a time when Devadatta tried to kill the Buddha, and he rolled a boulder down the side of a mountain, or could be a hill, and the Buddha was at the bottom of it, and this great boulder smashed into trees or maybe the side of a mountain or something, if the Buddha was in a valley, let's say. But in any event, this boulder smashed into, thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces, and the Buddha, being fully enlightened, was able to, kind of track all of what was happening and to avoid any kind of real injury, whereas an ordinary being would have definitely been killed. But there was a tiny sliver of all of these thousands and thousands of shards of rock that drew a thin, maybe a dot or a thin line of blood from the Buddha. And that was the best that Devadatta could do in his efforts to kill him. That's where this phrase, maliciously drawing the blood of a Buddha, because a Buddha, being omniscient, is really, really hard to kill because they kind of know what you're going to do. They know, and they can get out of the way. They can, they can track things. I don't know now with nuclear weapons and so on, maybe it's different than it used to be. When a boulder was the weapon of mass destruction that was available 2,600 years ago, now we do have nuclear weapons. So, maybe it's a little bit different, but the takeaway is, if someone's fully enlightened and you make an effort to wound them in some way. And it says maliciously because if you're a doctor, you might draw the blood of a Buddha to run a test because they're manifesting in ordinary form. So they might manifest illness. They might, for various reasons. And so doctors, there are fully enlightened beings presently in our world, and they might be undergoing medical testing and so on. So the intent isn't malicious. The intent of a doctor in that situation is to help. So they can draw the blood of a Buddha as long as it's not with malicious intent. And they can even do surgery on a Buddha where, there's harm to the body, but again, it's not with malicious intent. We're going to have to leave it there for tonight. Let's see yeah, that's a good place because we finished verse 2. Any thoughts or questions about the first 2 verses or anything that we've covered tonight?
No.
Thank you for keeping me company. I appreciate it. Have a good night, and we've got 2 more classes where we'll finish up.